We just 10 minutes if we can. Yes, there's a question here. Yes.
Madam Chair, I found the presentations extremely interesting, but I'd like to sort of focus on the last presentation by Lady Olga Maitland. She spoke about UNAMSIL. I have some experience with UNAMSIL, having been in New York at that time without a military advisor in the Indian mission. And when the 13,000 strong Indian contingent was deployed at UNAMSIL in Sierra Leone, the Indian government was not consulted about the mandate, and that brings us to the core question of the Security Council and the mandate for peacekeeping operations. I was India's representative when Lakhdar Brahimi presented his report on the UN operations. I do know something about UNAMSIL, and I would like to remind this distinguished speaker, when she referred to the Indian contingent in UNAMSIL, I'm sure she will recall Operation Kukri, where the 5th, 8th Gurkha Rifles of the Indian Army, accompanied by the 14th Mechanized Infantry Battalion, broke out of Kailahun, fought a war, and rejoined at Daru to a rapturous welcome from the people of Sierra Leone. And if I remember correctly, it was the River Mao where a memorial still stands till today. The problem with UNAMSIL was not the lack of fighting abilities of the member countries or the troop contributing countries. The fault squarely lay with the UN Security Council in giving a wrong mandate, number one. Number two, for constant interference by one P5 member who had troops on the ground and a parallel force called ICOMOG, which was also on the ground. And there were problems between the force commander, General Vijay Jetli, a very distinguished general of the Indian Army, and the SRSG, the special representative of the Secretary General. If I remember his name correctly, Oloyuni Adenechi, who was earlier the permanent representative of his country in New York. So I think you have given a very jaundiced and biased view of one incident which is not entirely correct. What had actually happened was that the only action that was really fought by the UNAMSIL at that point of time was that Operation Kukri in Kailahun and Daru, for which the Indian peacekeepers received a lot of kudos. And as you're aware, India has lost more peacekeepers in UN peacekeeping operations than all of the Western countries, perhaps barring Canada combined. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your comments. In fact, I think your comments spelt out extremely well the dilemmas and the incoherence of UN management. And I think this is really the key to it. Sir David Richards, who became our Chief of Defence Staff, was very clear that something more active should have been done. It is an interpretation. I think this is one of the great problems that faces UN peacekeeping operations everywhere, and I thought in a way you actually illustrated extremely well the conflicts between one department and another, and this is why there has to be much more clarity exactly how far a peacekeeping operation should go, and then particularly when civilian lives are under threat. And I think the challenges facing the UN today have massively changed. It's civilians now who are mostly at risk. The peacekeeping operations are dealing with much more blurred lines and facing with insurgents and terrorism and all the non-state actors, which make life extremely challenging. The real problem is the UN has still got to catch up with the times, and I think they're struggling to do it. And I think this incident in Sierra Leone encapsulated those difficulties.
Any more questions? Can you see? No?
Excuse me.
Where are you? I can't see you, but just...
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm Colonel Khan from Pakistan Embassy. I'm the defense advisor here. My question basically is for Lady Olga Maitland, and indirectly it will go to Professor Adrian as well, because he mentioned cricket as the element of soft power. And why I'm addressing both the Englishmen is that basically you come from the home of cricket. Well, my question is in the backdrop that sometimes when we use certain forums as a matter of soft power, but then they turn out to be an exploitation. For example, in cricket, initially it came very enhanced for all the cricket playing nations, but suddenly a big three comes out and the equilibrium of power is disturbed. At the same time, when we use certain NGOs and certain elements of softer power in various nations, but especially in certain South Asian countries and in certain African countries, these NGOs are taken as something suspicious. So many of the countries are now formulating certain very strict laws for these NGOs. So my question is that how can we protect the sanctity of these basic forums like cricket, like NGOs, like Facebook, like Twitter, that they can't be exploited? Your comments, please.
Cricket, I'll leave it to the gentleman. But the issue about NGOs, I think, is an interesting one, because you have wonderful NGOs who do brave and courageous, non-stinting work. And then, frankly, there are other groups who masquerade as forces for good, actually are Trojan horse for rather sinister organizations. And I think we have to be very careful. We've seen that happen, particularly in the Middle East. So NGOs, my view is, embrace them, but I think there has to be very careful understanding with whom you're engaging, because they can do wonderful work beyond the reach of the military. But if they are an insidious organization masquerading as a force for good, then of course it's completely counterproductive. So there is a difficulty, but I think on the whole, when I've seen what NGOs have done over the decades, I particularly followed what they were doing in Bosnia-Herzegovina, because paradoxically, between the peacekeepers and the NGOs who were taking in all the aid convoys, it was the NGOs who actually were killed and injured most, far more than the people who were guarding them, because they were going in with soft-top trucks, they had no guns of their own, they weren't allowed to, and in a sense, they were the ones who were most exposed. So there are some real heroes, and there are also real heroes doing that same work, let's say in Afghanistan with mine clearing. However, amongst the good ones, I'm very doubtful, I'm very worried about insurgents and extreme radical groups getting into these NGOs and creating a totally different picture.
Colonel Susan Senratna, Sri Lanka Army. In fact, when we think of the social media in usage of terrorist organizations, we have been concentrating on militants, terrorists, extremists using the social media. What about those secret agencies? Thank you, ma'am. You came out with the fact that the work of the CIA. Don't we consider the world's affairs are being interfered, or they have been, organizations now orchestrating the situations such as a conflict situation where then the expansionist countries, interested countries have the space to intervene then. So the social media is also being used by the secret agencies. For an instance, if you take what happened in Egypt, deposing the president and supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm talking about the president who was disposed. So in that case, social media was extensively used by the secret agencies. Arab Spring was a fine example of that. So not only the terrorists, also the secret agencies are involved in that. We do not know who does what, number one. Number two, humanitarian operations. Now, as far as humanitarian operations are, nothing in this world is taking place without geopolitical interest, geopolitical influence, geopolitical importance. These are the three things that always, even the humanitarian operations works on. So how can we decide that it's a humanitarian for the purpose of humanitarian or with the intention of ultimate motive of the expansionism? Thank you.
Anyone else who'd like to speak?
Red Ranasinghe from Defence University, Sri Lanka. I'm of the opinion that the power and violence has a relationship, and especially the Kautilya's Arthashastra and also the Niccolo Machiavelli's Prince has a lot of evidence about it. And then there are peace scholars, present day peace scholars, they were talking like the John Galton and then William Sartman and Finchley Kisher, all these, the latest peace scholars has their theories too. And also, but present day the world order is moving to, I know we have seen that it is obvious that resorting to use of power more than resolving the conflicts in different way. What is the future of these peace scholars of today? That's my question.
I just wanted to try and understand exactly what his question was.
He wants to know the future of peace scholars.
Peace scholars.
Scholars.
Peace scholars. Well, my view is this. We do need analysts, we need thinkers, we need people to think outside the box, and we certainly need people to think faster and better than governments do. My opinion is that governments are always the last ones in the line to catch up with anything. And when we're talking, for instance, we listened to Dr. Gupta talking about cybersecurity and the way things are moving on. It's very evident the global energy is faster than the cumbersome bureaucratic governments. And I would like to see more encouragement for think tanks. Thank goodness they exist. But I think that the government should listen very carefully to what people are trying to tell them, because we are into a big global shift. Take, for example, Europe. We in Europe have great difficulty in understanding China. China is undoubtedly the new kind of power on the block. We don't understand them. They're everywhere. They're part of our lives. They even want to build a nuclear power plant in England. Nothing strange about that. But it's strange because it's from the part of the world we don't understand. So I do believe that sometimes you need people to interpret and analyze where that new engagement is coming from. And I certainly do believe that the role of think tanks is critical in helping governments to get to grips with the issues of the day. But we're in a very changing world, and keeping up is a massive task.
Short comment. Hello? No, I don't think so. Yeah, can I just use it? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Just two short comments. I think a lot was mentioned about UN peacekeeping and the discussion which took place, comments from the floor. What struck me was that I think we should have a balanced view about UN peacekeeping. Just think for a moment, there were no UN peacekeepers. and what impact it would have on international security. The point I want to make is that the UN peacekeepers, majority of them come from the developing countries. They are doing their job extremely professionally, and they are working under tremendous constraints. And as was pointed out, I think the problem is with the definition of mandates, missions, and so on, and even sometimes perhaps the resources that are required. And there is all kinds of tinkering with that happens. So we should give due regard to those who are fighting in those, or who are keeping peace in those very difficult conditions. So the professionalism of those people needs to be kept in mind. Then there was a question about the future of peace studies. I think the future of peace studies is great. More and more violence that you will see in the world, there is a more and more hankering for peace as well. And we should not underestimate that. A common person, an ordinary person does require that peace and stability. And all the UN really exists for peace. And in India, at least I can mention that there are a number of universities, particularly the Banaras Hindu University, and also the Jawaharlal Nehru University, etc., where a lot of peace research is taking place. And just as we, quoted some scholars to enforce the view that the world is only to be seen through a realist framework, there are any number of scholars who would give you a different viewpoint. And I think peace research has a great future, and this needs to be encouraged. Thank you.
I would agree with what Dr. Gupta said. I think probably the biggest value that peace scholars, old or new, bring to this is a critical perspective. And the more that we can understand what they've got to say in terms of looking at this entirely complicated and complex conundrum that I think many of the people in the audience have really highlighted, the better. People like Mark Duffield, Michael Pugh, Jane Bolden, Claudia Ardau, Rosa Brooks, just to name 5, I think carry on a lot of this analysis and bring some of it into perhaps different perspective than we've heard today. On the issue of how do we make sure that humanitarianism is humanitarian, I think it's a never, as I mentioned, it's a never-ending battle to protect the humanitarian space through the definition and, as much as is possible, the protection of the humanitarian principles. And where cases of fraudulent humanitarianism or strategic humanitarianism is found, it should be called exactly that, and certainly discouraged by everyone when they come across it.
I'd like to thank the 3 panelists for a very interesting session.
Madam Chairperson, can we sing one last question?
Yes, yes, of course.
My name is Romesh De Silva.
Yes.
I want to put this question to all 3 panelists. Now, Madam Del Glenn mentioned about the Rwandan, and now the Undersecretary responsible for United.
We can't hear you. Something wrong with your mic? Can you? Something wrong with your mic? Can you?
Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Madam Glenn spoke about the Rwandan genocide. Now, during the Rwandan genocide, the Undersecretary General in charge of United Nations peacekeeping was Kofi Annan. And however much scholars talk about new concepts and however much soldiers spill their blood, there's no substitute for proper leadership. How can the greater public take credence on when people like Kofi Annan, who was responsible and failed at that critical moment when a great genocide was perpetrated, is later on made the Secretary General, and 7 years down the line given the Nobel Prize, and nobody raises any questions. How do you respond to the credibility issue? Thank you.
I am by. Hello. I am by. Hello.
Yeah, try this.
I am by nature an optimist, and we're now soon going to have a new Secretary General of the United Nations. I'm not an angry feminist, I never have been, but I'm quite reassured by the idea that there is a chance that the new Secretary General of the United Nations will be a woman. I hope she'll be tough and fair-minded, as indeed the other leading women politicians across the world are currently today, because there's no doubt about it, those events of Rwanda and indeed Srebrenica have left a deep scar. Now, I hate the cliche, lessons have been learned. It's something that shouldn't exist, because if people really did learn lessons, we wouldn't make these mistakes. However, I think the time has come for new and clear thinking. I hope that the new Secretary General will revisit the Brahimi report and see where it needs updating, because events have moved on even since the report was written in 2000. Here we are, 2016, rising 17. And events, even in these years, have changed dramatically for the challenges facing peacekeeping forces. They have, everyone I think appreciates the lack of clarity. And I must say, I hope it's not telling a tale too much out of school, but I was a member of the British Parliament during the time of Srebrenica. And there was much talk in the House of Commons about Srebrenica being a safe haven. And to a small group of us in the House, we felt it was a nonsense and was forever trying to alert the Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, the Secretary of State for Defense Sir Malcolm Rifkind, and indeed Sir John Major, our Prime Minister, that this was giving rise to a false hope for which there was no reality to back it. This is the problem. Unfortunately, our concerns met deaf ears. There was still an idea that they were sticking to old mantras. I would like to think that in the next mandate of the new Secretary General of the United Nations, much clearer thinking will come in, much more concise and much more incisive thinking will come in to give us a new dawn. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to bring this session to a close. Let me just say that